Thomas Wentworth Higginson, born on December 22, 1823, was a Massachusetts pastor known for his involvement with abolition and women's rights movements across northern states such as New Hampshire and Massachusetts. He is best known for his rather controversial co-editing of the first volume of Emily Dickinson's poetry. His attempts to smooth out the irregularities in Dickinson's poetry are thought to be responsible for her lack of publication until after her death. Beyond the well-meaning preceptor, however, is a man whose life was dedicated to the rights of others. Though he was as religious as anyone else of his time, his clergy position was largely a means to an end. His position as pastor allowed him to be a figurehead for local rights movements, becoming a founder and co-editor of American Women's Suffrage Association and its related periodical, The Women's Journal. Wentworth Higginson would be financially involved in abolitionist movements such as John Brown Raid, but served directly as commander of the 1st Regiment of Black Troops during the Civil War. Higginson would primarily write historical pieces, usually of black rebellions. It was these writings, as well as his essays on writing in general, that led to his interactions with Emily Dickinson. Higginson's audience, considering how broad his messages were, can be difficult to identify at first. As a preacher, basically anyone who would listen would be good enough. Based on his history in northern states, his command during the Civil War, and his involvement in many movements beyond abolition such as women's suffrage, it can be said with confidence that his intended audience was white men of the northern states. Much of his writing seems to assert the inherent nobility in those who fight, both physically and legislatively, as a prime reason for readers to relate to those he writes about. His descriptions of Nat Turner paint him as a desperate but intelligent man of faith, running counter to Southern depictions of Turner as a violent, unrepentant killer. Higgins seemed to favor any reform in society so long as it was rapid and widespread. This is supported by his involvement with the American Women's Suffrage Association, who sought blanket voting reform for not only women but black men as well. This did not rule out the use of force, as he readily joined the Union Army in the name of abolition. As for his motivations for this life spent towards abolition and reform, Higginson generally sticks to an early developed conviction that his life's purpose was simply to be a reformer. This influence is largely traced to his mother and education during his childhood. The outlines are certain, the details are inferential. From Higginson's Nat Turner's Insurrection, a passage from his writings on Nat Turner, a black revolutionary. In describing Turner's history, Higginson explains how much of his personal life and motivations of slaves are difficult to narrow down, as it is exceedingly rare for a slave to write down their personal experience. Details can then only be gleaned from the history of those around them. Ironic, considering Higginson's personal motivations and life becoming overshadowed by his pupil Emily Dickinson. What we know about Higginson's life comes mostly from what he was involved in, rather than who he was as a person. Higginson as an individual and personal human being, usually by his own design, is overshadowed by his direct or indirect involvement in pushing reform in America.